you've been talking today about your client, and that's another term that could use a little bit of definition, I think, sometimes. Could you talk with us a bit about who's the one who picks up the phone and calls Denny Martin? And under what circumstance does that happen? And then once you get that phone call and you go into the organization, are you working with the person who called you or somebody else? How does that work?
It varies. The good consultant answer is it varies. And after I get over the delight about being called, which is always a thrill, you begin to get really clear about who the client is. It's often the case where I'll get called probably in one of three ways. I'll get called by an individual who wants to do some work on themselves. I'll get called by a superior in an organization who wants work done on someone else. Or I'll get asked to work with a number of people, and what will emerge is the need for one individual in that group to benefit from some coaching. Regardless of where the request comes from, being just absolutely clear-eyed about who the client is. The client is the individual and it's the organization. And this is where it can get a little tricky. The organization has a vested interest in the success of the individual. They're a key contributor. They have a very important role in the organization. And so I owe them the very best work that I can do given the boundaries that they've established around the client that they'd like me to work with. Now, that doesn't mean I share information with them, unless, of course, there's something that's going to threaten the life of the organization, which is so rare it's not even worth mentioning in many ways. But fundamentally, it's the client is the individual that you're working with, and that's a very, very important and almost reverent relationship in a consulting methodology, because you want to maintain extraordinary integrity around that, so that that person feels both the safety and the willingness to take risks within that coaching relationship. So the individual, the organization are both clients. The primary beneficiary here is the individual.
And does it happen ever, or even often, that you get called in by an organization, some superior who wants you to work on a subordinate, and when you find yourself working with that person, they're hesitant to be involved in the process? I mean, I have to think they have to be engaged.
Sure, it's a very demanding moment. It doesn't need to be so dramatic, but it can be a challenging moment for an individual, particularly if your boss has decided that in some way, shape, or form you need to do some work. And if that information comes as a complete and total surprise to the potential client, that tells you something else. It tells you that the relationship of communication between the boss and subordinate isn't terribly healthy, and could benefit from some improvement. And so one of the additional pieces of work you might suggest in a situation like that is, yes, while we're working with Joe or Mary, there's also an aspect to the working relationship between the two of you that could use some work. And you may want to take a look at doing that work. There are individuals who, with all due respect to them, just decide that they don't want to do it. And if they do the work of working with a coach, of their own, working on their own personal and professional development, that really the only reason they're doing it is because the boss said so. That's not work I'm interested in doing, and I don't believe it's in the best interest of anybody to have that kind of relationship go forward. And so it has happened where you just go back to the initiator of the call and say, I don't think this is going to work, and I don't think it's worth doing.
You know, I've heard in consulting situations where people are like, well, you know, that's going to take my people away from the important work that they need to get done over this short period of time. We've got projects underway, we've got management responsibilities. If I put them into this, in this case, leadership consulting venue, then they're not going to be working on the big issues that are facing them today. How do you respond to that challenge?
I think it's a healthy pushback, and I think the balance that needs to be both understood and appreciated is that there's a fair amount of wasted time, effort, and energy that comes with leaders who aren't as effective as they could be in areas like communication, conflict resolution, making decisions, solving problems, growing and developing people around them. And what will occur oftentimes is just a lack of focus on the key issues that organizations say they want leaders focused on. They want them paying attention to the strategic rather than the day-to-day tactical. And as a result, if you could clean up and sharpen their skill set around how they lead, frankly, you're going to free up time for them, not spent on needless conflict or missed communication, and get them really to a more effective place in terms of the work that they do.
So you take some of those real-life examples that they're dealing with right now into the leadership coaching and
absolutely
work on them there?
It's the only way that I work with a client is that while scenario building can be an interesting exercise, I'm only interested in working on real examples with people because that's where they live. That's what they've got to walk out of our meeting and deal with. And so if a client is having a particularly conflictual relationship with a key contributor on his or her team, we talk about that, and we talk about alternative ways of interacting and of being more effective, so that when they leave our conversation, they're able to go out, potentially experiment with some new behaviors, and then when they come back in the next week or so, we're able to talk about it and talk about what worked well, what didn't work well, whether my brilliant idea helped or didn't, and give them an opportunity to be more successful with real issues.
It's interesting that what you've mentioned on a couple of occasions now, that the individual you're working with also often has superiors and often has subordinates themselves, and so the work you're performing with them, and I don't use this in the pejorative sense, but has that halo effect in a way.
Yes.
That the work that they're doing, the better they get, in a way, the better everyone around them gets, or the more comfortable everyone around them gets. It sounds like there's a huge opportunity or advantage or benefit, if you will, for the organization as a whole, not just the individual you're working with. Can you address that a little bit? It's
really one of the interesting side benefits, particularly of a feedback process. If I'm asked to work with Joe or Mary, and they say, yeah, let's do the work, and I say, well, give me the list of a dozen folks that we ought to talk to that you work with on a regular basis, and gather their perspectives, their insights into their experience of you. And so I'll go talk to those people individually, I'll gather data, and I'll put it together in a summary form, not identifying authorship, but put it together in a summary form for the client. After having asked all of those questions of those individuals about the client, the change has already begun to occur in how they work with each other. Because what they're acknowledging and what they're seeing through the feedback process is that the client is interested in growing and developing and working on themselves. And so the individuals in a process like that are very often will say to themselves, gee, I wonder what I could be better at. First of all, you're encouraging them to admire the risk-taking that the client has undergone here, to go ask people, what do you think of me? And encourage in them, the participants in the process, to take a look at what they might improve, what they might do better, because we can all get better at something.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Could you, for our audience, could you bring kind of a tangible example to that? Could you draw from an example of a client engagement that you've worked on where that has been the service?
Sure. It was a complicated client. I was working with a senior management team. One of the members of that team, who was the head of an operation, the operations function in the organization, was a very, very hard-driving, very, very accomplished operations person. And he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. He just did. And you brought it to his attention, and it was if you pointed out the fact that he had deliberately wounded people. And he was shocked that he was having this impact on others. So, hey, Bob.
Talk about a blind spot.
Hey, Bob, come on. Where have you been? But it's, I don't mean to make light of it, but it can be kind of comical when you look back on it. And what began with awareness building in Bob of the impact he was having on others really rippled through the rest of his team. And what shifted, and this was just a really very rewarding thing to observe, rather than putting the most unfavorable interpretation on something Bob said or did, people began to put a more neutral or even a more favorable interpretation on his actions or his memos or his desires for people in the group. It didn't solve world hunger. I understand that. But boy, was there a shift in how they worked together. And rather than people being put off by his style, people began to understand that this is a rough edge of his, and if I just stand with him a little longer in this conversation, we can get to the real point, rather than me walking away unhappy or feeling bruised by the way he's done it. And to recognize that this is something that Bob himself wants to change and work on. So it was a pretty rewarding experience.
I imagine. And it sounds like that there must have been great value that was derived by the company, by the individuals and by the company as a result of that activity.
There are, I believe, Pat, both tangible and intangible benefits to coaching leaders in the context of a solid organization development approach to change. And the tangible benefits, I think, are about reducing churn or turnover in key people, losing that intellectual capital that resides in those folks, all of that, the experience that they have, their ability to look at problems and solve them in ways that are familiar to the organization and what works well. And the cost of replacing people is extraordinary, especially senior people. And organizations would like to avoid those costs at any way they can. The intangible results, I think, there's a full spectrum of them. I think that the higher the level of satisfaction an individual has with his or her role in the organization, they typically will perform at higher levels. They're going to be more creative. They're going to be more innovative. They will take more risks. And they will raise the horizon of what they're focused on out further down the road, because they're not having to worry about the day-to-day and the potential rough edges that have caused problems for them. And so they've rounded those off to the extent that's possible. And there's also the ripple effect in the rest of the folks around senior leaders. When they see the senior leader taking on aspects of themselves that they want to get better at, they're willing to do that themselves. And that, I think, creates a climate where positive improvement, positive development can really lead to benefit for everybody that's involved. Now, I think it's honest to say that it has a two-step forward, one-step back feel to it. We're human beings. We make mistakes. We stumble. But what happens, I think, is that there is a building momentum toward a more effective way of interacting with people, and recognizing that all of us have aspects of ourselves that we could look at, be more knowledgeable and aware of, and make changes to make us more effective. One of the things that I think is really right at the heart of the connection between organization development, leadership, and really good solid coaching is the appetite that an organization has for improvement and moving in the direction of their vision. I believe that appropriately utilized, effective coaching of senior people can keep those senior people from becoming isolated, maybe less effective than they'd like to be, and having the kind of impact that is going to move an organization forward and, frankly, grow and develop the people around them. The leaders of tomorrow, our bench strength in organizations, if you will benefit from the modeling that these leaders of today, who are looking at themselves, working on themselves, and looking at all the alternative ways of being more effective, that's going to be very effective leadership development, and organizations will change in the way that people want them to at the top. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denny Martin. Again, a renowned organization development and leadership consultant focusing on executive and employee coaching. It was great to have you in the studio today. You can find more information on our website, www.grahall.com, from Denny Martin, and other information about Grahall's services that help organizations maximize the value exchange between organizations and their people. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Pat.